The Department of Veterans Affairs has spent $33 million on legal battles with veterans, fighting compensation claims. In other words, racking up a legal bill to deny veterans that to which they are entitled, $33 million. Ben Roberts-Smith said he'd no longer recommend young Australians join the Defence Force under its current leadership, and says Defence has failed to support veterans. I receive stacks of correspondence from veterans needing help. The way they're treated is a disgrace. If Ben Roberts-Smith says don't join, that'll do me. Normie Rowe is a war veteran. He was Australia's biggest pop star in the 60s. He defined the logic of the times. His period of peak popularity came when the Beatles were dominating the charts around the world. He was a Melbourne teenager, creating pop riots. He became the first Melbourne recording artist to achieve a national Australian #1 single. In fact, he was one of the first Melbourne entertainers with the long hair of the new Beatles-influenced music era. EMI had its chance to sign Normie Rowe. EMI in Sydney said he couldn't sing. Well, he released a single on a suggestion from his mentor, Stan Rofe. It was a version of the Porgy and Bess stage musical song, It Ain't Necessarily So. When he went on stage, there were riots. Venues were crowded beyond capacity. Fans fainted from Normie Rowe worship, and the hits kept coming. In 1966, at the age of 19, he toured with Gene Pitney. He toured America with Roy Orbison. Why am I telling you this? Well, the biggest challenge to his career came at the hands of the Australian government. We were involved in the Vietnam War. 20-year-olds were liable for conscription into the military. Normie Rowe's name came up in the first 1968 intake. Most conscripts were selected by a ballot of birthday dates. Normie Rowe would find out much later that his birthday was not one of those that was drawn out. It had been suggested by many that Normie Rowe had been conscripted because of who he was. He served time in Vietnam, one of the lucky ones to return. But those 2 years away from his fans cost him dearly. Australia had a new kind of pop hero in Johnny Farnham. The Normie Rowe pop star era had ended. And on return, no matter what he released, he was rejected. Well, he has since then become a magnificent Jean Valjean in the musical Les Mis. He's had leading roles in other musicals like Annie, Chess, Evita and Oklahoma. And he's been inducted into the Australian Recording Industry Association's Hall of Fame. But he was one of a large number of veterans who, after returning home from active service, found great difficulty returning to normal life. It has taken government in this country a long time to realise that there are problems with returning veterans. And whatever assistance is available is extremely difficult to access. Normie wrote to me only last weekend to say, and I quote, "The adversarial attitude of government agencies makes the journey of gaining access for psychologically frail veterans an extremely daunting process. Admittedly," he said, "once a veteran has been accepted by DVA," that's the Department of Veterans Affairs, "on average, services are pretty good, but trying to navigate the minefield of applying for assistance can be soul-destroying." Well, can be anything more soul-destroying than an admission the Department of Veterans Affairs has spent $33 million on legal battles with veterans fighting to prevent them getting compensation. I asked Normie to join us from the Gold Coast, and he's there in our studio. Normie, good evening to you. Thank you so much.
Good evening, Alan. Good evening, Peter.
G'day.
When you hear all that, how do you feel? I know you've been through very, very difficult times, one of many veterans in that predicament.
I just don't understand how government agencies from Defence through to the Department of Veterans Affairs, even the Prime Minister's office, cannot realise the dire problems that exist with returning ex-service people, men and women. It's now 50 years in about 4 weeks' time when I arrived back in Australia, and I wasn't sure what was going on in my own mind. My old man said to me, the best thing you can do is forget you ever went, get on with your life, and don't concern yourself about anything to do with Vietnam again. I think a really bad thing to say to a veteran, especially one who lost 4 mates, people I knew very closely, and then I had to wear it more or less to bury it down for a long time. And I've now been diagnosed with PTSD, and it's almost 20 years. I look back on the previous 30 years when I wasn't diagnosed, and I realised some of the events that were PTSD related. And I just think, if it was happening to me, then why wasn't it happening to, there were 50,000 other Vietnam veterans. And when the Welcome Home parade happened, and you were very instrumental in making that successful, Alan, when that happened, there were tears, I think in the gallons, spreading all over the Domain grass when we were standing up ready to march, and during the concert on the following day in October 1987. And I started to realise that there was something more than what people were talking about, Agent Orange. There was something else, and I did a lot of research. I found that, in the first 2 years of returning from active service, nearly 10% of all Vietnam veterans had committed suicide or been involved in single-occupant, single-car accidents. In other words, suicide. And yet, it took decades again for people in government to start to realise that maybe there was a psychological connection. Even then, just more recently, over the last 2 or 3 decades, as we know, tours of duty of the young people going to the Middle East and the other places we've had deployments in the last 2 or 3 decades, the tours of duty are much shorter. Okay, so we've started to realise that if you're in a life-threatening situation for more than 6 months, you will present with post-traumatic stress disorder for the rest of your life. We know that. So what we'll do is we will have 4 or 5 month tours of duty, negating the idea and the notion, which has been accepted in the medical fraternity, that PTSD can take place after accruing constant deployments. Okay, I've been over there once, I've been over there twice, and every time a Defence Force person goes off to deployment, there's another level of PTSD.
You wrote to me,
it's a horrible thing.
You wrote to me at the weekend and said, just as a broken leg requires healing, so too does a broken psyche. And I don't want to invade your space too much, but it does help our viewers to understand. You also wrote, and you said, in 2001, one day before the events of 9/11, I was admitted to a psych ward of Palm Beach Hospital on the Gold Coast after a suicide attempt, suffering from the effects of depression, anxiety from the PTSD I had been diagnosed with previously. I spent 3 months trying to come to grips with my condition and the knowledge that I was to live with this for life. I know that with strategies learnt from health professionals, I can survive, but in those early times I was living in desperation. I now feel for the young people who haven't yet been able to access that support. What people like Peter and I don't understand, Normie, is that you've got RSLs, Departments of Veterans Affairs, state and federal, bureaucrats coming out of our ears. How come these people don't understand it and aren't prepared to reach out to alleviate those sorts of problems?
I think because of the upper echelon of all these people that have an incredible disconnect with their constituents. And by the way, your constituents, RSL, DVA, and many other organisations, your constituents are people who have been deployed in the service of their country, and they've come back, and they are the people that you are supposed to be representing. And I'm afraid you're just not doing it. All you're doing is sucking up to each other the RSL to the government. The government suggests something, the RSL accepts it. You know, what we really do need, and what Ben was saying, is we do need an inquiry into the deaths of returning
yeah, I agree with
people.
that. Normie, Peter Credlin here, I 100% agree. There must be a Royal Commission. I think the government will be mugged by reality. It's interesting, the Prime Minister said he kept an open mind. The Veterans Minister, Darren Chester, who I don't rate as a minister, I have to be honest, he was pushed out saying, no, we're not going to have it. The Prime Minister, though, yet has not said we're not going to have it. So I suspect the Prime Minister will have to come in over the top of that minister.
I'm glad you mentioned the Minister for Veterans Affairs, because I don't know who he is. And I've known all of the Veterans Affairs ministers since I came back in 1969.
Yeah, he's a pretty arrogant National Party MP from Gippsland, but I'll make one other point. It's always struck me as weird, inappropriate, probably unprofessional, that veterans, which really is like a social security department, administers the care and support of former military personnel. I think if Defence are good enough to send you and brave enough to send you and in many cases wrong enough to send you, and governments, Defence should own the veterans who come home and all the associated problems. So I think veterans should go back inside the Defence Department. And there are tens of thousands of public servants in Canberra. If you want to employ a veteran, put a veteran in charge of Veterans Affairs.
Absolutely. Look, we've run out of time, unfortunately, but Normie, we're going to have you back. This is just the beginning. We're not going to give up the fight, so you're not on your own, and understand that the people out there are on your side, not on Darren Chester's side. Thank you for being so open and honest with us. Good luck, and we'll keep in touch.
Thanks very much.
Lovely, Phil.
Thanks, Peter.
There he is.